Check. My check. 1, 2, 3. My check. Check. On manta. Check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My check.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. So we'll start our second day of the Institute Seminar Days. So the first speaker is Sita Brusina. We'll talk about Devo Eco.
So 5 minutes. Oh, sorry, what 5 minutes? 2 minutes. Yeah, thank you. All right, so good morning, and it's always a pleasure to speak to a home audience. So I'm going to talk about some recent work that we have been doing and which promises, in some sense, the emergence of a new area of science, which, I thought I had coined the term Devo Eco, but Shondip just told me that he's already seen a few papers with this title. So anyway, so clearly it's something which is in, the Zeitgeist. So I'll explain what it is all about, but let me first thank my collaborators, Chandrasekhar Kumudi, who did his PhD, finished his PhD about a couple of years back, and Shakti Menon, who is of course in the audience. What happened? Did I do something wrong? Hope not. Okay, hold on. This is always like Murphy's Law. All right. Yeah, so being a physicist, I always tell my collaborators who are from other disciplines that, we are arrogant bastards, right? And this is well encapsulated by Rutherford's famous quote, "Science, there's only physics, the rest is time collecting," right? And when you look at biology as a physicist, it looks like the ultimate in stamp collecting, right? At least that's what used to appear to me when I was a high school student, so much so that I refused to take biology as a subject in my 11, 12.
Nobel in chemistry.
Sorry?
Rutherford got a Nobel in chemistry.
That's true. Yeah, so but according to him, it's actually all physics, right? So anyway, so because biology seems like a loose leaf of just disparate facts. What's the connecting thread? Okay. So as a physicist, you start asking, are there universal organizing principles like in physics, right? Now biologists may kind of find this a very weird kind of way to ask things about biology, because why should all sciences have this thing? But when you're a physicist, you just can't help it. It's in your training. Right? And in some sense, the first glimpse into such an universal organizing principle, one might say, well, as physicists are concerned, would be Crick's famous central dogma, well, Crick and Watson you might say, but essentially which said that, all of life follows this principle where the information that is central to life is encoded in the nucleic acid, DNA, which essentially is converted to RNA, and then the RNA is used to create proteins. So the interesting part is that the letters used by DNA, the nucleotides, are distinct from the letters used by the protein, which are amino acids. And so you need a translation process to go from this language to this language, and essentially the central dogma connects these two great polymer languages of life. So that's actually a brilliant organizing principle which connects essentially life on Earth, all of life on Earth as we know it. So if you're studying life from a molecular point of view, this seems like as good a candidate as any. However, about a decade back, I was attending a talk by Amitav Joshi. Many of you might know him. He's an ecologist in the JNCSR in Bangalore. And he gave this brilliant, figure. The figure is my adaptation of what he said, where he said that, look, there is a grand unified theory of biology. And it goes like this. It involves three basic concepts, that of genotype. Okay, so basically it's the set of all genes which essentially make up a particular cell. and phenotype, which is the external appearance of the organism and the behavior associated with it and so on and so forth, and fitness. Okay? And how do you connect these three basic features? Well, the genotype essentially determines the phenotype by the process known as development. Okay? So when you are born, you're born as a single cell. So all the information that is required to create this, what you see over here, this multicellular organism, is there in that single cell. But how do you actually take that information encoded within DNA to create something, which looks like me? That is, of course, still not completely understood, and that forms the crux of the area in biology known as developmental biology. Okay? All right, so you have individuals now who look like something, who are interacting with other individuals of the same type and other individuals of a different species altogether. And this essentially creates their environment. And that is studied by the area of biology known as ecology, right? So this is what determines the fitness of a particular phenotype or of a particular organism. So fitness is essentially how well you do with respect to others of your kind and others of different species. All right? And finally, it's this fitness which makes, through natural selection, certain phenotypes and thereby genotypes much more likely to survive to the next generation. And this is, of course, the famous theory of evolution through natural selection. Okay? And so, Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace had essentially, came up almost simultaneously with this concept of fitness, which is this individual reproductive success. So, it doesn't matter, how endowed you are. What matters is how many offsprings, viable offsprings you leave behind, because that will determine how fit you are. And this essentially results in a certain set of heritable characteristics of an organism to be better at it than others, which finally lead to this observable characteristic or traits of an organism. So I remember once, talking about this with my former graduate student Anand, who was, one of those people who were obsessed about a particular branch of science, and for his case, it was neuroscience. So, he might, to paraphrase Rutherford, to him, everything was neuroscience. The rest was completely boring, right? And he asked me, where in this diagram is neuroscience? It makes no sense if neuroscience is not there. So I thought, maybe there's a point there. And so I realized that, okay, actually phenotype is not just about organization and not just about, what you see, it's also your behavior. And so essentially you're talking about genotype determining behavior, but as we all know, that's a really difficult problem to go from genes to behavior. And Sidney Brenner, who's shown here, actually pointed out that instead of trying to directly go from genes to behavior, it's way easier to break it into two problems, namely, how does the genotype determine the nervous system? And how does the nervous system determine behavior? And so you have neuroscience appearing here, and genotype determining brain is, of course, part of developmental biology. All right, so that in a nutshell is my modified view of Amitav Joshi's grand unified theory. And then, people have, of course, been looking at these things for over 100 years. As you can see, these people are basically from the 19th century, right? Except Sidney Brenner, who's from the 20th century. But the new development is that now people are finding that only talking about evolution or only talking about developmental biology, only talking about ecology in isolation with others cannot explain certain phenomena. And so then you have new sciences developing which combines various aspects of, for say, evolution and development. So this is the science of Evo-Devo, which developed about, I think, 2 or 3 decades back, which essentially compares how do different organisms develop. And by this, they're trying to see how the process of development itself evolved. Okay? So if you have single-celled organism, of course, there's no question of development. But the moment you have multicellularity, then you have to start from a single cell, you have to keep dividing, and finally you have to become a recognizably human or a recognizably tiger or a recognizably duck or whatever, all right? So how does this developmental processes evolve over time? So that's essentially this science of evo devo. A little later came another, in some sense, interdisciplinary science, the science of eco-evo, or rather I should call it evo-eco, because it's evolutionary ecology, which examines how interactions between and within species evolve. Okay, so let's say I eat whatever, something, right? And that species eats something else, and that species eats something else. So these are trophic relations. But how did it evolve? Okay, so we know that certain species can only eat something very specific, namely pandas eat only grass. We eat everything, right? So why is it that certain organisms have evolved this extremely specialized approach to having food? Others are essentially omnivores, okay? Right? 1 more minute, okay. It's, wow, thank you. All right, so essentially what we are doing is basically looking at this third branch, namely how do interactions with other cells and environment influence development. Essentially we are looking at how the ecology, that is the environment and the interactions with other organisms essentially affect the development. And why do we need it? Essentially to understand how we go from the single cell to this entire creature. Okay, I just wanted to show this particular picture to show you why this is of interest. So this is something called the zebrafish, a fish which has this stripe-like striations, which is why it's called a zebra. Essentially it's a fish. Okay, so some problem with the movie, of course, as usual it has to happen. Oh yeah, right. So, so it starts from a single cell and then it develops, okay, over time into something which is recognizably a fish embryo. Okay, so you will see that so far it looks pretty much like a spherical cell, and then over time a kind of asymmetry will happen. So you can start already seeing the formation of this asymmetry. So this is the head and this is the tail, and then the backbone is gradually developing, and then you will see that suddenly this part will disengage from the yolk and start developing into a recognizable tail. You can see the beginnings of the eye and the brain and so on and so forth, and then gradually, so this is basically counting in seconds. So this is basically showing you how at 52 hours post-fertilization is going to look like. And so now you can see it pretty much looks like a fish embryo. All right. Okay, so since I'm out of time, I will just scoot across to my final slide to just show you that essentially what we are doing is to understand how local interactions, that is interaction between neighboring cells, interacting with a global field, essentially through the diffusion of morphogen or chemicals, allows the particular form that we characterize with an organism like a human or a zebrafish to develop. And where physics comes in the fact is that this is something which will be very familiar with people who do, for example, statistical physics. So if you're doing spin models, we know that the spins interact with their nearest neighbors, but they also respond to an external field. And in some sense, you can actually map this problem of developmental ecology to a problem in statistical physics where you're asking how does local interaction between cells essentially interacting with a global field like a morphogen concentration gradient give rise to the complex patterns that we characterize with an organism. So let me end by thanking the people who are associated with it. As I said, Chandrasekhar, who finished PhD some a couple of years back and now is postdoc at Harvard, and Shakti Menon, who is of course in the audience, and of course acknowledged funding from the Department of Atomic Energy.
Thanks a lot for the very nice talk. So we don't have time for questions now. Maybe you can talk to Siddhartha later. So the next speaker is Reshmi. So she will talk about, I think, some combination of queuing theory.
Good morning, everyone. At first, I want to thank the organizer. So, as the title of my talk suggests, I will be talking about how can we reduce the waiting times in queue with service resetting. Queue is a real world problem. In our daily life, we have to stand in a queue to get some service, starting from the bank, in the supermarket, in the ticket counter, or at the time of airplane boarding. Every one of us have to wait for some time to get the service. So, what we will usually think that what are the factors which will determine the length of the queue. So primarily one would think that the arrival rate of the jobs and the service rate are the key factors. So suppose you are in a supermarket, though the arrival rates of the customers and the service person at the cash counter are the key factors which will determine the length of the queue. But are these only two factors which determine the length of the queue? So let us discuss that. So suppose you are in a supermarket and you are shopping. So after you have done your shopping, you want to stand in a queue to make the payment. Now you see there are two queues in front of the cash counter. One of the queue is larger than the other, and for the first queue, as the queue is large, so you would expect that the mean service time of this service person is higher compared to the cashier on the other counter. Then what we will usually do, we stand in the shorter queue. But after some time, you may find that the last, so the last person has already made their payment and has gone out of the queue while you are waiting in the queue to get your service, and you were stuck in the queue. So this happens with every one of us. The queue we select to stand moves slower than the other queues. Why is this so? So here comes the inspection paradox, which says that we are biased when we are visiting something at random times. So suppose for the first queue, though the mean average, average service time is larger for this person, it can happen the fluctuation is large. So suppose the mean service time is 4 minutes, but sometimes it takes 4 minutes, sometimes it takes 5 minutes, or sometimes 3 minutes. So the fluctuation is small. So the intervals are almost equally spaced. But here it can happen for him, though the service average service time is small, the fluctuation can be large. Therefore, the intervals are not equally spaced. It can happen the average service time is 2 minutes for him, but sometimes he can take 1 minute, sometimes 2 minutes, or even sometimes he can take 7 or 8 minutes to serve. So as the fluctuation is not equally spaced, the intervals are not equally spaced, it can happen. So that the inspection paradox says that we will fall at the position when the interval is large. That's why you have to wait a longer time. You will fall in this, the probability is large that you will be fall in this large interval. Therefore, there is a tendency to observe the large interval. And so not only the arrival rate of the customers and the service rate of the service person determine the length of the queue, but also fluctuation plays an important role here to determining the queue length. And the mathematical quantities here is the coefficient of variation, which is the fluctuation in service time divided by the mean of the service time. And for this distribution, you can see as the mean is much greater than the fluctuation or the standard deviation. So for this narrowly dispersed case, the coefficient of variation is smaller than 1. For the marginally dispersed case, the fluctuation, the standard deviation and the mean are comparable and CV is 1. But for the broadly dispersed case, the fluctuation is much greater than the mean. So the coefficient of variation is greater than 1. And now I will discuss about a queue where the jobs are served based on the first come first served policy. So here you can see a queue. Here the jobs arrival at a rate lambda, and this is the server, and after the job is served, they just gone out of the queue. So the mean number of jobs here given by the famous Polacek-Khinchin formula, named after the two people, Felix Polacek and Alexander Khinchin. So here the mean number of jobs, you can see N is the mean number of jobs, and S is the average service time, and here lambda is the arrival rate, and rho is lambda multiplied by S, which is called the utilization parameter. And you see, not only the average number of jobs depends on the arrival rate or the service time, it depends on the CV square or the coefficient of variation or the fluctuation. So if CV square is greater than 1, this term is positive, so that it will contribute to the average number of jobs in the queue at the steady state. And this N, so this N is highly sensitive to the fluctuation, and it increases with the coefficient of variation. So if you now plot the mean number of jobs in the queue at steady state, it will be monotonically increasing function of the coefficient of variation. It increases linearly as the fluctuation in service time increases. So all of us, we want to try to minimize our waiting time, so that we have to wait for a minimum time to get our service. So what can be the strategy to reduce this waiting time? So resetting the service can be one of the answers. So first I will give a brief overview about resetting. So resetting was generally motivated by the problem of search problems. So such problems are everywhere, like we are the animals searching for food, we are searching for our glasses or the keys, and we have written a code and we try to debug our code. Such problems are everywhere. So it can happen, you trying to find the solution or your target for some time, but within that some finite time, you could not manage to find your object. So what you can do, you can just stop there and you restart. You just start the process afresh, and this time it can happen that within as you are following a different trajectory here, so you may get different pathways to explore and you can find the target this time much faster and easily. So stochastic resetting can expedite the random search process. Suppose you have a process which starts here and finish here. So within some time you cannot find the object, your target, and you just reset afresh, and there is a higher possibility that you will find the target now more faster. And it has been shown if the fluctuation or the coefficient of variation is greater than 1, restart, it is guaranteed that restart will help you to finish the process faster. So here I have shown again the broadly dispersed curve. Here as the fluctuation is greater than the mean, so CV will be greater than 1. Now what we mean when we say queue with resetting. So here I will talk about the case when fluctuation is intrinsic to the server. I have told before that the fluctuation in service, there is a fluctuation in service time, but this fluctuation in service time can arise due to a number of facts. Like if suppose you are shopping and you have 4 bags of items, someone, your next person have 10 bags full of items, so their service time cannot be equal. The server must take different time, or there will be a higher fluctuation in the system when the customers have different number of items. But here I am talking about when the fluctuation is intrinsic to the server. That means suppose the service person or the cashier are serving for a longer time. He or she may get tired and there will be a fluctuation in the service time. And what do you mean by service resetting here? So you can reset the server or you can reset the service. How can you do that? You can give the cashier a break, just give him a coffee break and bring a new service guy in the system, and this effectively will decrease the mean queue length with the fluctuation. So in this picture you can see the red curve was the mean number of jobs which was monotonically increasing with the fluctuation in the system. As soon as we incorporated resetting in the system, the mean number of jobs deviates from the red curve, the green one I am talking about. It will deviate from the red one and will start decreasing. Even you can see when the fluctuation is larger in the system, but the mean number of jobs is decreasing with the fluctuation. And it is to be noted that when the mean number of jobs for a higher value of fluctuation is even lower when there was no fluctuation in the system. So the negative effect of the fluctuation, which was giving rise to the longer queue and the larger waiting time, now the stochastic resetting or resetting service reverse the effect, the stochastic fluctuation, and you can see this major drawback has been turned into an advantage. So what we have done, so we have associated a overhead time with the queue. What do we mean by overhead time? Suppose you are working on your desktop and it is lagging. What will you do? You just restart your computer. But this rebooting your computer will take some finite time, right? And so when you are resetting your server, it will take some finite time so that a new server come and he will accustom to the new job. So he or she will take some time before serving the jobs. That's why a overhead time or a time penalty can be associated with resetting. And here we have taken some different distribution of the overhead time, and each of the cases we have seen that the mean number of jobs is decreasing with the fluctuation in the system. We have taken CV S1 is equal to 0 and CV S1 is deterministic. That means every time the S1 is random but it's fixed. And for some of the for other cases the overhead time comes from different distribution, but for every cases we have shown that the service resetting, with service resetting you can decrease the mean number of jobs with the coefficient of variation, and which deviates from the original Polozek-Khinchin formula, which was linearly increasing with the fluctuation, but service resetting decrease the mean number of jobs, so that you have to wait for a minimum time to get your service done. And so the detrimental effect of the fluctuation in queue can be mitigated by service resetting. Even in the presence of an overhead time, service resetting reduce the mean number of jobs. So when there is no hope and you are in doubt, just remember to reset. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this nice talk. Again, we ran out of time, so if you have any questions, you can ask her later. So the next speaker is Ramya Nair. She'll talk about classification of manifolds.
Okay, so I'm Ramya. I'm a postdoc in the mathematics department. As you can see, the title of my talk is Classification of Manifolds, and if time permits, I'll talk a little bit about my work. So we'll start. Okay, so I have not included many rigorous definitions here, so I apologize for the lack of rigor. Okay, so let's start with a basic question, like what is a manifold? So a manifold is a topological space that locally looks like a Euclidean space at every point. So an n-manifold or an n-dimensional manifold is a topological space which looks like Rn at every point. N is the dimension. So a couple of familiar examples of manifolds are lines, circles, spheres, tori, etc. So one of the most important problems in topology is to say whether any two given objects are homeomorphic. So homeomorphism is the notion of sameness you have in the branch of topology. So here the important problem here is to say whether two given topological spaces are homeomorphic. We may ask the same question about manifolds. So this problem is called classification problem of manifolds. So we know that there is only one closed one-dimensional manifold up to homeomorphism. So a closed manifold is a compact manifold without boundary. So it has been known for quite some time, I mean a long time, that there's only one-dimensional manifold up to homeomorphism. So a two-dimensional manifold is called a surface, and we have this list which says that any closed connected surface is homeomorphic to one of these. So if you are given a closed connected surface, it's either a sphere or a torus or a connected sum of tori or a projective plane or a connected sum of projective planes. So connected sum operation, for those who do not know, is you take two manifolds, you remove two open balls, and then identify the boundaries that are created by this open ball. So that is a connected sum of two manifolds. So, sorry. Okay. Okay. So yeah, so that is a connected sum. So in surfaces we have this nice little list of manifolds that you can possibly have up to homeomorphism. Let's see what happens when we go to higher dimensions. So when the dimension of the manifold is greater than or equal to 4, such a classification theorem is not possible. It is because to every manifold which has, I mean for every n greater than or equal to 4, there is a manifold whose fundamental, for every finitely presented group there is a manifold whose fundamental group is that particular group. So one has to at least classify all finitely presented groups before attempting to classify n manifolds. But this problem of classifying finitely presented groups is known to be unsolvable. So of course we have no hope of classifying manifolds of dimension greater than or equal to 4 up to homeomorphism. So, okay, so now the interesting dimension, I mean interesting to me because I work in dimension 3, is that here you don't have a possible list of manifolds as you had in the case of surfaces, but there is a classification theorem. That theorem is called geometrization, and it was proved fairly recently. It was proved in 2002. So this theorem states that every closed 3 manifold can be decomposed in a canonical way into simpler pieces that each have one of the 8 types of geometric structures described by Thurston. So Thurston is the person who conjectured geometrization, and it was proved much later in 2002. So these are the 8 geometries that are described by Thurston. S3 is the 3-dimensional sphere, E3 is the 3-dimensional Euclidean space, H3 is the hyperbolic space of dimension 3, and then you have S2 cross R, H2 cross R, the universal cover of SL2R, and 2 other geometries called nil and sol. So these are the 8 geometries described by Thurston. I'm not going to get into any detail of what these things are. So the geometrization theorem states that any oriented prime closed 3 manifold can be cut along essential tori so that the interior of each of the resulting pieces has a geometric structure with finite volume. So this geometric structure is going to be one of the 8 geometries that I mentioned earlier. So the interesting thing about these 8 geometries is that out of these 8, all of them except the hyperbolic space and this particular geometry called solve admit a decomposition into circles. So they form a special class of manifolds called Seifert fiber spaces. So my work is primarily on Seifert fiber spaces. The orientable manifolds in this class have been well studied. So what I did along with my advisor in my thesis is to extend some of the well-known results for orientable Seifert fiber spaces to include the non-orientable class as well. So, okay, in the study of surfaces, there are these curves called essential curves that are very important. So why are they important is because you can cut along them and end up with smaller, simpler manifolds. So for example, in this torus, the blue curve is an essential curve. If you cut along that and fill up the boundary, then you get a sphere. So a sphere is a considerably a simpler manifold than what you started out with. So essential surfaces in 3 manifolds are a generalization of essential curves. We may cut along them to obtain simpler pieces. For instance, Hagen proved that an orientable 3 manifold can be split into 3 balls by cutting along certain essential surfaces. So if you noticed in the statement of geometrization 2, we have this word essential. So there also the 3 manifolds are cut along essential tori to obtain simpler pieces that admit one of the 8 Thurston geometries. So the thing about Seifert fiber spaces is that the essential surfaces over here can be put into a particularly nice form. So, I'll recall the definition of what a Seifert fiber space was. So it is a manifold that admits a decomposition into circles. So this entire 3 manifold is made up of circles. So there's a little bit more to the definition, but so you also need a torus neighborhood around, a solid torus neighborhood around each of these circle fibers that you have. So that is the complete definition of Seifert fiber spaces. So here, these essential surfaces can be put into a particularly nice form. So what do I mean by that? So if your manifold M is a Seifert fiber space and S is a surface, a properly embedded surface, then it is called horizontal if it is transverse to all the circle fibers, and we call it vertical if it is composed of those fibers. So for example, this is a solid torus. You take a disk, cross an interval, and identify the top to bottom via identity map. So this disk that you have, the red colored disk, so yeah, so here the circle fibers are, you take any point here and then cross S1. So that is how your, this particular manifold is made up of circles, so that is the fibration here. So you can see that this particular red disk, it is transverse to all the circle fibers, and this blue annulus, it is made of circle fibers. So this particular disk is what I call a horizontal surface, and this annulus is a vertical surface. So, okay, so yeah, so this is, so the result is that in an orientable Seifert fiber space, any two-sided essential surface can be isotoped to become vertical or horizontal. This is a fairly old result. So what we did is we proved a generalized, such a theorem is called a structure theorem. So we proved a generalized structure theorem for essential surfaces in Seifert fiber spaces, removing restrictions on orientability of the manifold and two-sidedness of the surface. So like this was actually an extension of the work by Frohman and Renard. So the statement of our theorem is, so this is in, so this is a part of my thesis. It was with my advisor, Dr. Tejas Kalelkar from IISER Pune. So the theorem that we had was, if M is a Seifert fiber space, possibly non-orientable, which is at least one singular fiber, and if you have a properly embedded essential surface, then that essential surface may be isotoped to become pseudo-horizontal or pseudo-vertical. So I'm not getting into the definition of what pseudo-horizontal and pseudo-vertical are. So when you have non-orientable manifolds, it comes with additional structures. So, and also I'm removing the restriction of two-sidedness. So again, like when you don't have to, when you allow one-sided surfaces as well, you cannot isotope these surfaces to become horizontal or vertical. So we need some, there are some exceptions that come into the picture. So that is captured by this pseudo word here. So I'm not getting into the definition of what it is. So this is what we did. We extended the structure theorem to include the class of non-orientable manifolds as well.
So let's, so we have time for one question.
Maybe you can explain the connection of your work to the Poincare conjecture and what Perelman proved. I thought Perelman had proved
The geometrization conjecture, yes.
I mean, all closed three manifolds are connected sums of primes. And
Yes,
I
yes.
thought he had classified all the primes. So,
Yes.
so
yes, yes.
is this a special case of that classification, or is this something beyond?
No. So Thurston's geometries, there are 8 of them. So except hyperbolic and one other geometry, the 6 of them, they admit decomposition into circles. So they are Seifert fiber spaces. So that is, my work is on those manifolds, like except hyperbolic, the complement of hyperbolic manifolds. So it is a part of the conjecture only. Like the manifolds are not, yeah,
So,
they are
but
Seifert.
you are not using the techniques of Ritchie flows and so on.
No, nothing. This is like purely topological, no analysis.
Okay, so let's thank the speaker again. Our next speaker is Shoshikanto Mohapatro. He will talk about scale mechanics. Seems like a-
So, hello. So let me first thank the organizers for this amazing seminar and giving me an opportunity to present my work. So basically, I work on the interface of condensed matter physics and quantum statistical mechanics. So I'll be presenting escaping chaos, because even the system I work with, they don't like chaos in their life. The more technical title will be quantum many-body scars. So the beautiful phenomenon which had been studied in the recent year quite extensively. So, but disclaimer is that I have used only simple pictures So it's a crude simplification of quantum mechanics so that it can be accessible to all of them. So expert, please bear with it. So let's consider a ball bouncing within a boundary without loss of any momentum. So this is a particular boundary and the ball is just bouncing up. It will just reflect from the boundary and it just continues to moves on. So eventually what will be the trajectory of the ball looks like. So this is for like two generic boundary I have taken. So it will just look like this. It will just explore the whole space available to it. So if we start from any particular initial condition, I mean any particular position and any particular direction, and I ask you, where is the ball after a long time? So it is very hard to answer because you have to literally track each angle by angle reflection, and then let's say you do it using some supercomputer. But there is an independent effect which comes to play and makes your hard even more difficult. Because if you just by chance slightly miss the initial condition wrong, then this little error will grow like a snowball. And this effect is called the so-called butterfly effect, and which is the hallmark of the chaos. So this chaotic motion of the ball, that is the unpredictable motion. So I look at on the perspective of that, it gives rise to loss of information, because whatever the initial condition is, wherever the ball starts from, the system will eventually explore the full space. It will just disperse over the whole space. Okay. So do system exist where we can predict the motion of the ball at all time? Is there any pattern? Yes. Those systems are called integrable system. For example, if just change the boundary to a circle, and if you have a circle, if you start the ball from any initial condition, then there will be a stable periodic pattern. The ball will fails to explore the full space available to it. But these systems are very ideal and very hard to realize in nature. So the question I want to ask is, can we make a smart choice of initial condition so that we can escape the chaos in an otherwise chaotic system? That means, let's say the first example, the first stadium I saw, can we make a smart choice so that we still have a predictable pattern? Yes. So for this, the example is that look at this, this initial direction. I mean, if you just push the ball any of this pattern, I mean a periodic orbit, it will just try to keep in this orbit. So this is called the name scar, because it just looks like a mark in the boundary. So these are like some other stable periodic orbits, sorry, unstable periodic orbits. Why unstable? Because if you just slightly deviate, then it will just again follow the same pattern, chaotic pattern, and it will just disperse. So okay, this is some other boundary for other, yeah. So just one technical side, is there any quantum mechanical version of this? Yes. So what we do, we just replace the ball by free particle and the boundary by infinite potential and the boundary, and you just solve it using Schrodinger equation. And what we look at it, typically all the eigenstates, so in quantum mechanics, so we just look at, we can't say where the ball exactly, we just look at the what is the distribution of probability of the ball. When what is the probability that ball at any place. So this shows that, I mean the dark region shows that there is a high probability of ball finding there. So typically most of the state will look like this. I mean it will again disperse. I mean the ball can be anywhere. But there are very few states which will just like follow the classical pattern. That means it will have high overlap of finding the ball at this unstable periodic orbit. So this is called the quantum scar. But life is not so simple. We have multiple particles and we have interaction. Let's say I will just simply tell you one example, just briefly, without going into details. Okay, let's say we have L balls, L interacting ball, and what is the interaction? That the ball can be changed color interacting with its nearest ball. That means the ball can be color or colorless. So the interaction, let's say there is some interaction which changes the color. So simply look at this graph picture. So what it says is that, so all the nodes are all the possible configurations of the ball. I mean how many ways you can arrange this colored or colorless, and that is some concern, I don't want to talk about it. And what is the link is that the interaction between the ball. For example, let's say you start from this. So these balls, this arrangement of ball interact with themselves and change the colors to go to this configuration, and this configuration. Similarly, from this you can go to this configuration and this configuration. Technically, the adjacent matrix of this graph is called the Hamiltonian, and the system will evolve under its Hamiltonian. But okay, just look at the simple picture. Let's say this is a man where it has his home here, and these are like other cities, and these are the roads. So I just want to ask, if the man starts from his home at time t equal to 0, where will be the man after time t? Again, we are dealing with quantum mechanics, so the man has some probability distribution. It can be at a particular city, but with some probability. We cannot say that, okay, it is at particular this city at this time. So we just do it using quantum mechanics. But what the result is that after some time, we will see that the man is omnipresent. That means man has probability of finding the probability of the man is equally distributed over all the cities. So that means the same phenomenon that happened earlier in the classical picture exists in the many-body pictures. That means that it just distributed, the probability just got distributed. Okay? Now we just ask the same question again. Can we start from a point such that it has the finite chance of coming back? That means just like the stable periodic orbits that is there. I just want to ask that if man has some chance of coming back to his original home, because we don't want him to stay away from home. So does car exist in this many-body picture? So for example, if you just start the man from this configuration, I mean this city, then what we will see after some time, okay, the man has probability distribution like this. That means it distributed over all the nodes, all the points. Then again, after some time we will see there is a finite chance, there is a finite chance that man come back to his original position. Then again it will be distributed. Then again it will be come back to its original position. So this, this light says that, it has very less probability of staying here. Okay. So mathematically, if you just look at the quantity called return probability, that means what is the probability that the man comes to its original position, and if you just plot it, so what you will see, so this is for the corner state here. If you just start from this state and look at the time, so it has at certain period, certain amount of time, it has finite probability that it will come to its original position. And if you start from any arbitrary initial state, you just look at it, just the probability is 0. It means why 0? Because let's say I have taken this for L equal to 24. The number of nodes is 1 lakh. So if it's equally distributed, so it will be like 1 by 1 lakh. So it is like very low. So this is the picture of scarring, but with many bodies. So okay, I am not talking just something, so it has been experimentally verified, where there are like 51 interacting ball, let's say, and the number of nodes is like, you can see the numbers, 10 to the power 7 or 8. So there also they have seen some oscillations in certain time scale. So it is experimentally verified. So after that, has been extensively studied. So what my contribution is like, what the questions I am trying to answer, like there are two questions I am trying to answer. The first one is, given the nodes and links, technically given the Hamiltonian, what are the good starting points so to escape the chaos? Let's say we have this picture, where can I start so that I can come back to its original position? That means I can predict something. So technically, given Hamiltonian, if scarce state exists, what are the scarce state? Or the second question is that, given nodes, given cities, and given a starting point, what are the links? What are the interaction? What are the roads I can build so that I can come back to the original position from where I start from with some probability? So these are the two questions I am trying to answer. So far we have this one work done, that means predicting this thing in the spin one-dimensional spin 1 Kitai model, and we are now working on this thing in transverse field Ising model. So yeah, I like to conclude. Okay, this is not visible. Some famous quote I copied from my recent talk, from ICTP, that to learn more and more about less and less until I know everything about nothing. So thank you. Maybe I have some time.
Thanks a lot for this very nice talk. Do you have questions?
Like this UPOs that you talked about, unstable periodic orbits,
Yes, yes.
they are basically the basis for chaos control, whereby giving small nudges to the parameters, you try to make the trajectory in a classical system
Yes.
go to the stable manifold and thereby stabilize this thing.
Yes, yes.
Is there an equivalent analog for quantum systems that you can think of?
Single particle. I mean, this
Yes.
one, this is the picture
Well, right. So
Yeah.
can you generalize this for a quantum system? I mean,
so this is the quantum picture. So
right. No, I'm saying that, but this is not a stable system, right? I mean, or rather, suppose I start from some arbitrary initial state.
Yes,
Can I take it to the analog of the UPO?
okay,
quantum
from
system?
starting from any initial
Yeah.
state, can I go to this?
Yeah.
No. This is very, I mean, these are very fine tuned, I will say,
All
this
right.
pattern.
But there is nothing analogous to this control of chaos that you do in classical systems.
No, I mean, quantum mechanical, it is very hard to.
Just, just a quick question. Was it clear from your talk? So these results you're getting, are they like proven, like exact results, theorems that are proved, or are these based on sort of simulation?
This, the pattern we are showing.
Yeah, no, you showed that graph and all, right? So those are based on simulation, but you said you have some.
These are like actual Hamiltonian, actual system. We are just mapped to, this is a theoretical mapping of actual system. So this is our system exactly.
And these are solved exactly, is it?
So these are solved theoretically exactly.
Okay,
Yes, exactly.
thanks.
And this is the mapping to, this particular experiment is mapped to that.
Okay, thanks a lot. So maybe you can talk to him later because you're running out of time.
Can I ask a question? I'll stop. You have no time.
You can talk to him.
Thank you.
Let's thank the speaker again. The next speaker is Anirudh. He will talk about surface condensation on microtubule.
Okay. Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Anirudh. I'm audible, right? Yeah. Okay. So today I'll be talking about surface condensation of tau proteins on microtubules. So I'll be mainly showing some interesting results from a set of experiments and motivate the direction in which we're thinking about these. So just to give some background. Cells are extremely crowded. There are a few billion proteins and all other kinds of molecules, but it's not a homogeneous sack. They're not well mixed. There is a great degree of spatiotemporal control and compartmentalization. So the question is, how do cells do this? So the traditional way to think about this compartmentalization is that they do this using organelles, which are membrane-bound bodies. So these are enclosed in lipid membranes. So some examples are nucleus, mitochondria. But there's another way to achieve this compartmentalization. So there's recently been interest in this field of phase separation, and so there are these things called biomolecular condensates, which are essentially liquid-like droplets formed out of proteins or RNA. And I've just shown some examples here. These ones are in cells. These are created artificially, but the idea is that you have certain molecules, and when the interactions between similar molecules are strong enough to overcome the entropic effects, you get phase separation. So by concentrating certain proteins in a region, you have compartmentalization. So yeah, and these are not bound by any membranes, so these are much more dynamic. Yeah. So in cells, surfaces are quite prevalent. There are membranes, there are polymers like DNA and cytoskeletal network. So these condensates often form on these surfaces and they interact with them. So I've just shown a couple of examples here interacting with the membrane and the chromatin. So the key question we're interested in is what are the physical principles behind this macromolecular condensation on surfaces, especially in context of biological systems. So we'll be focusing on surface condensation of tau proteins on microtubules. This is the experimental system that we're dealing with. So microtubules are really long, stiff polymers. They perform a host of functions, some of which are like providing structural support for the cell, and there are other functions they do. And tau proteins are associated proteins, microtubule associated proteins, and they stabilize the microtubules. So in these experiments, so these were done by a group in IBT Prague. So what they do is, so these are in vitro experiments. They're done out of the cell. So what they do is they take a microtubule, stick it onto a glass cover slip, and introduce fluorescently labeled tau proteins. And now these proteins form they condense onto this microtubule, and we can visualize them. So, okay. Yeah, I'll just show this quick video. Yeah, so that's what we're seeing here. These proteins condense on these microtubules, and then they stabilize. So this is what it would look like in a more zoomed out fashion. So there are a few So there are a few key features from their experimental observations that we'd like to understand. So let's look at them. So the first one is that if we look at the intensity of these molecules along the microtubules, and we look at the distribution of these intensities, it's a bimodal distribution. Now this is really interesting because microtubules are made up of a single kind of monomer. They're usually thought of as a homogeneous surface. But the fact that there are two distinct states of condensation, it's quite interesting. Another interesting feature is that these, as we had seen in the previous slide, these proteins don't coat the microtubule completely. They form islands, and the fraction of microtubules covered by these proteins is dependent on the concentration. So yeah, it's not like homogeneous binding. So these are quite interesting. And another result is from these experiments where they introduce the tau proteins, and after the islands have formed and stabilized, they wash them out, and this is done repeatedly in cycles. So what we're looking at here is a chymograph. Along this direction you have the microtubule position, and this is time, and these light and dark bands that we're seeing are repeated cycles of introducing the tau protein and then washing them out. Now when these tau proteins are washed out, you see the island shrinks, right? And these islands shrink and they'll completely disappear. But what is really curious is that even after the islands completely disappear, in the next round when the tau proteins are introduced again, the islands form at the same location. So there seems to be some sort of memory associated with the system. And these islands are not just forming at random locations. Also one more interesting thing is that these islands are pinned to the surface. They don't move much. So these are some interesting observations from their experiments. So we'd like to come up with a simple model to understand what's going on. So now because there's axial symmetry in the system, we can just take a 2D we're working with a lattice gas model, and we can take a 2D model, and we can call this part as the surface because there's symmetry in the system. And so each site in the lattice is either occupied by the protein or it's unoccupied. If it's occupied, we denote the state by 1. If it's unoccupied, we denote it by 0, and we can write the Hamiltonian. So this accounts for interactions of the proteins in the bulk. This accounts for interactions of the protein when they are bound at the surface. So there's experimental evidence to believe that these tau proteins have enhanced interaction between themselves when they're on the surface. There's something called cooperativity. And there's a term accounting for site-dependent affinity of these proteins onto the surface, and there's a chemical potential, which allows exchange of particles with the environment, keeping the concentration fixed. So if we look at, so the site-dependent affinity that we have, if we take a homogeneous affinity, so that's the kind of null model to begin with, because the microtubules are expected to be homogeneous. We do see some similarities to the experimental observations. So I've juxtaposed results from, I forgot to mention, with the Hamiltonian, we're doing Monte Carlo simulations. So yeah, these are results from the simulation, and these are experimental results. Again, this is a chymograph. So we're looking at microtubule position and time. And we see these formation of islands and also fusion of islands as seen in the experiments. And there are some other qualitatively similar features to the results, but I haven't shown here. But one key difference is that we don't see distinct states, we don't see islands when we take a homogeneous affinity. There's only a single state of condensation, and this is also reflected in the histogram of it. So heterogeneities in the surface affinities are required. Now these can be, so there are these things called post-translational modifications. Certain molecules can come and bind to monomers of these microtubules and cause heterogeneities in its affinities. So possibly heterogeneities might be created by these. So with heterogeneous affinities, we do get something that's not a homogeneous profile here, but it's still an ongoing work, and I don't have results to show for, like I can't make any claims. So, but the key thing is that a homogeneous affinity is not sufficient to explain the data, and heterogeneities are required. So now, I mean, we have a model and we have some observations, and there are qualitative similarities to the results, but we'd like to understand what's the physical mechanism behind this formation of these islands or this condensation. So there are a few theories of like surface condensation, but the most pertinent one to like these experiments are something called pre-wetting. So the idea is that so this was given by John Kahn in 1976. He gave the thermodynamic theory for this pre-wetting. So the idea is that when you have a solution and molecules and there's some surface introduced, at lower concentrations you have a thin adsorbed layer, and as you increase the concentrations, it will discontinuously transition to a thick condensed layer. So this was by Kahn, this was by Kahn, this was shown to be a first order transition, and this was the phase plot given by Kahn. So the fact that there are two distinct states of condensation, and that's what we see in the experiment, indicates that this mechanism of pre-wetting might be at play in this system. Also, like I'd like to point out, I mean even the lattice gas model that we're using does show in this regime, it shows first order like phase transition. So pre-wetting along with heterogeneities in the affinities might be responsible for these islands that we are seeing in tau proteins. Yeah, so I'd just like to summarize. So there's a physical understanding of this macromolecular condensation is not present. These tau proteins form concentration dependent islands on microtubules. Homogeneous affinities do not give rise to islands, so this is important. So heterogeneities need to be present, even though the microtubule is a homopolymer. And pre-wetting along with heterogeneity may be the physical mechanism behind these formation of these islands of tau proteins on microtubules. So this might be like a nice system to study macromolecular surface condensation in general. So I'd like to thank Zdenek, Marcus, and the students Eva and Teresa at IBT Prague. So they do the experiments, and also Sandeep with who I work here. So yeah, thank you for your attention.
So you have time for maybe one question.
Yes.
Hi, so if these macromolecular condensates don't form, are there any pathologies which occur in the cell? Is this physiologically relevant?
Yeah. So tau proteins are actually implicated in, so they are actually concentrated in neurons, in axons. And since, I mean, axons are really long and you have the microtubules there. And so these tau proteins stabilize the microtubules. And there are like pathological states where these tau proteins form aggregates. And these have been studied in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So that's why this is relevant, but also it's a nice system to study the physics of surface condensation.
Okay, so let's thank the speaker again. And we'll be back here at 11:40. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. And where is the pointer?
There's the pointer.
Yes.
Hello. Hello. Yeah.
Hello. So welcome second session of the day. So first speaker we have Professor Ajit Balram. He'll talk about statistical mechanics of fractional quantum Hall effect.
Okay, so let me also start off by thanking the organizers for giving me this opportunity to disseminate my research to such a broad audience. So I'm going to tell you about statistical mechanics of the fractional quantum Hall effect. And this is the first work that I ever did in this field, so I've decided to pick that up and tell you about it. Okay, so the plan of the talk is as follows. I'm going to first give you a very quick introduction to what are called integers and fractional quantum Hall effect. And then I'll tell you how you can understand the fractional quantum Hall effect in terms of what are some exotic objects called composite fermions. And then I'll come to the main part of the talk, which is building up the spectrum of fractional quantum Hall using these composite fermions. Okay. So experimentally, the integer quantum Hall effect was discovered by Klaus von Klitzing. So probably all of you know what the Hall effect is. You take a sample, you put it in a perpendicular magnetic field, you run the current one way, and you measure the voltage in the opposite direction. So what Klitzing did was take a two-dimensional system of electrons, placed it in a strong perpendicular magnetic field, ran the current this way, and measured the voltage this way. So this ratio of the transverse voltage to the longitudinal current is what is called the Hall resistance. And what he found was this Hall resistance was exquisitely quantized in some fundamental units. H is the Planck's constant, E is the charge of the electron. And this quantization is as exact as we can measure. So it's just limited by instrument capabilities. And this effect is independent of of details of the system. So whether you take systems as different as like transistors or graphene or gallium arsenide, they all produce the same effect. It does not depend on things like what is the sample geometry, what kind of impurities you have in the system. So it's quantization in a macroscopic system. So this sample can be like centimeters long and you still see this quantization. So how do we understand the integer quantum Hall effect? So if you don't have any magnetic field, then electrons just pile up and fill up what is called a Fermi liquid. So you just put electrons and just depending on their density, they fill up to some number of states. But in the presence of a magnetic field, this spectrum splits into highly degenerate bands called Landau levels. So each of these levels has many degenerate states. And whenever you fill an integer number of these levels, you get a gap to the system. And the gap is what is crucial to the quantum Hall effect. So whenever you have a gap state, you get quantization in this system. And here the gap is set by what is called the cyclotron frequency, and this frequency is just proportional to the magnetic field. So if you go to higher and higher magnetic fields, you can increase the gap and you get better and better quantization. So one nice thing about why this shows quantized transport can be understood using semi-classical physics. So as you all know, in the presence of a magnetic field, you have this thing called the Lorentz force, where if you have a charged particle and you put it in a perpendicular magnetic field, it goes in closed loops. So in the bulk of the system, these loops are closed, so they don't carry any transport. But if you look at the edge of the system, then you have these skipping orbits. And because the direction of these orbits is just fixed by the charge of the system and the magnetic field, these orbits cannot actually backscatter, because once the direction is fixed, the orbits can just move in one direction. And if you place some disorder or anything, then it just skips that and goes around, right? There is no way for this to backscatter, go back, because the direction of the magnetic field fixes this. So that's why this effect is very robust to things like disorder. So very soon after Klitzing's discovery, Sui, Stormer, and Gossard made better samples, went to larger magnetic fields, and did essentially the same experiment. But what they observed was this Hall resistance was quantized to units of 1/3 E square. So Sui seems to have remarked that he found quarks in a condensed matter system, and somebody told him that one should be very careful about capital M and small m. This is all a milli-electron volt phenomena, and quarks only come up in mega electron volt or higher energies. So quarks are not at all relevant to this at all. So this is the question that one is trying to understand. Why is it that you suddenly get some fractionally quantized Hall resistance? So fractional quantum Hall effect turns out to be an extremely difficult problem. So for a theorist like me, there is a nice limit in which you can describe the problem, where what you can do is you set the cyclotron frequency to infinity. So all the physics is happening only in the lowest Landau level. And this Landau level is now partially filled. So here is an example of filling factor 2/5. So you have 10 states in the lowest Landau level and 4 of the electrons occupy these states. So in general, if you have no interactions between the electrons, then this is a highly degenerate manifold, right? You have 10 choose 4 ways of filling 4 particles in 10 orbitals. But there are always interactions between electrons because electrons are charged particles and charged particles interact via Coulomb forces. So in this highly degenerate manifold, once you have Coulomb forces into account, you get a unique gapped state. So that is how you get fractional quantum Hall effect. That's what produces the gap. The Coulomb interaction somehow from this highly degenerate manifold picks a unique state. But we don't even know how to solve 3 particles interacting with each other. So what hope do we have of solving like an Avogadro number of particles interacting with each other? So progress in the field of fractional quantum Hall effect essentially comes from this old age Greek way of doing things where you essentially try and guess an answer and then check whether that answer gives you a nice representation of the actual Coulomb problem. So the first step in that direction was made by Laughlin, who essentially just proposed what the answer for 1/3 should be. So he proposed this Jastrow correlated wave function. So Z is the complex representation of the 2-dimensional coordinate. And what Laughlin proposed was that you take a wave function which is of this form, Zi minus Zj to the power m. So what this wave function does is if you bring 2 particles close together, then this wave function vanishes very quickly. So if the wave function vanishes, then what you get is lower Coulomb penalty for this. So if the wave function vanishes as quickly as you can make it vanish, then the Coulomb interaction energy is low. So that's a good way to form a ground state. Moreover, he actually showed that if you look at this state, and if you look at excitations of this state, so this is the ground state, now you go and look at excitations of this state, then this is actually a fluid that carries fractionally charged particles. So this is an amazing thing that happens in condensed matter physics, where you have electrons as the fundamental particles, but certain emergent particles come up which have no relevance at all to the electrons. So you get like E/3 particles in this system, where you only have electrons to begin with. So somehow magically things rearrange in such a way that you get emergent particles with fractional quantum numbers. So very soon after Suisse, Stormer and Gossard's discovery, better samples were made and there were like a whole zoo of fractions which were observed. And these go along this n/2n plus minus 1 sequence. So primarily you get states which are like 1/3, 2/5, 3/7, 4/9. So they all fit along this sequence. So one can ask, why is it that this sequence is particularly picked out? So actually one interesting thing to note is that if I actually remove the numbers from this plot, you cannot tell me which of these plateaus corresponds to integers and which corresponds to fractions. So phenomenologically, the integer and fractional Hall effects look very similar. So my advisor ended up asking this question of, can we unify these two together? So can the fractional quantum Hall effect be understood as the integer quantum Hall effect of certain emergent particles? And the answer turns out to be yes, in terms of what are called composite fermions. So composite fermions are electrons bound to 2 flux quanta or 2 vortices. So you have a system of electrons in a large magnetic field. From this large magnetic field, 2 fluxes go and bind to each of these electrons to form composite fermions. And these composite fermions to the 0th order approximations are non-interacting particles. So they don't talk to each other. And just like non-interacting particles in a magnetic field form Landau levels, these composite fermions themselves form Landau-like levels. And whenever an integer number of these levels are filled, you get fractional quantum Hall effect. So you can then work out the numbers and show that whenever n nu star is n, this is the number of filled lambda levels of composite fermions. And whenever that number is an integer, you get fractional quantum Hall states of electrons. So that's particularly why this n/2pn plus minus 1 sequence is picked out. Okay, so in terms of pictures, what do the states look like? So filling factor 1 of composite fermions corresponds to filling factor 1/3, and this actually turns out to be the same state as what Laughlin had described. This Jastrow correlated wave function that I had shown was actually the same. So filling factor 2 corresponds to 2/5, filling factor 3 corresponds to 3/7, and this is the main n/2n plus 1 sequence that you saw. And not just the ground states, you can also describe things like excitations very easily, right? If you want to say what is like a missing particle, that's like a missing hole in an otherwise filled level. Then there is an extra particle and you can get neutral excitations by putting these two together. Again, this is the way to now go ahead and build a spectrum. So if you just brute force exact diagonalize the problem, so let's say I take some finite number of electrons, put the system on a computer and then just minimize the Coulomb energy, then I get a spectrum which looks like this. So now how do we go about understanding the spectrum using the composite fermion theory? So this is actually at filling factor 3/7, it turns out. So the ground state will be described by 3 fill levels of composite fermions. So this is one unique state that you get. There is no degree of freedom that you have. Then the first excited branch of states you get by like a particle hole pair of composite fermions. And the degree of freedom that you have is where you place these composite fermion particles in holes, and that actually gives you this dispersion depending on how they are separated. And then these higher bands are all formed by taking higher and higher energies, excitations of composite fermions. So this is the ground state, this is 1 particle hole pair, this is 2 particle hole pair, this is 3 particle hole pair, and so on. And this is the way you can build the whole spectrum and get statistical mechanics out of this, because you just create higher and higher excitations. Okay, so that's basically all I had to say. So I would like to end with one take-home message. So the point that you can take away from this talk is that if you have electrons in a magnetic field and strongly interacting with each other, they are extremely unhappy. Okay, so what they do is they let go of each other, grab hold of 2 flux quanta from the external magnetic field, and then they are free particles which are very happy. So on that note, let me stop and I'll be happy to take questions.
So we have time for a couple of questions.
So can you explain all the filling factors with this kind of a picture, or still there is some mystery left?
Okay, that's a great question. So you can't explain all the fractions with this kind of picture because of this thing that you can get only like odd denominator fractions of this kind. So if you get, there are even denominator states that are also absurd. For that you need to put in some interactions between composite fermions themselves. So that one can do. This is called the Jan sequence, yeah.
And can you get a fundamental theory out of it, like Chern-Simons theory?
You can write down a Chern-Simons field theory using this principle, yes.
One question in the back.
So what is the 0th order you talk about?
What is the 0th order approximation?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the 0th order approximation is to assume that these objects are non-interacting, because only for non-interacting objects you get Landau levels. So I neglect interactions between these particles. But as Sayantan pointed out, if you include interactions between them, then you can get something more exotic. But the 0th order approximation is that these are non-interacting objects. So they form Landau levels.
How good they actually fit with the experimental data?
Yeah, so I don't have experimental results to show, but I have exact diagonalization results. So actually these dashed lines are obtained from brute force exact diagonalization. And this dot is obtained by this approximation, where in this approximation I've neglected interactions. So these dots essentially fit right over the line almost. So basically if I didn't tell you which were the dots and which were the lines, you won't be able to tell which is what. So it agrees extremely well with experiments also, but at least with theory it's very good. Yeah.
Given the wave function, that should be the ground state.
Yeah.
How far it is different from the real Hamiltonian?
So it's not very far. So if you look at the Coulomb Hamiltonian, the Coulomb Hamiltonian has this property that it's strongly repulsive at short distances. And if you look at, let's say, the Laughlin wave function, it's the exact ground state of a model Hamiltonian which has only the hardcore interaction put in. And also you can adiabatically connect from the hardcore interaction to the Coulomb. So topologically, all properties are the same. Microscopically, of course, they are slightly different.
Okay, with this, let's thank the speaker again for such a nice talk. So second speaker of the session we have Nandini Mitra. She will talk about from the myth of lone genius to emergent dynamics in social networks, the anatomy of a discovery.
Hi, good morning. Before I start talking about this exact topic, I have a question for all of you. Any idea? Any guess? Sorry? James Watt. Okay, I like that confusion. So, of course, we know his name, James Watt, but a recent work by F.C. Moon shows this diagram that during that time frame, this many people were actually involved in this whole process of network and the discovery of steam engine. But anyway, I'm not gonna talk about James Watt or his people involved in this network. But what I'm gonna talk today is the process, how this inscription got deciphered. But just a quick overview on the Brahmi, what is it? So Brahmi is the mother script of all the inscription, all the scripts we practice even today. It's the script of the subcontinent, the South Asia. So what happened here, around 3rd century BC, this, we see the emergence of this particular script. But if I just put a date like this, like on 3rd century BC, all of a sudden this script came into emergence, that would be a very wrong thing. So even before that, we get some sort of evidences, some sort of pot shreds and other small graffiti. But those are not enough to, run any analysis or to justify that we have an ample set of data. So 3rd century BC, what is happening? Ashoka, just to convey his messages to the mass, to the people, he started using it frequently, and that's why we have a corpora all over the subcontinent. So now what has happened, why I'm calling it long lost, because from 3rd century BC onwards, this inscription, the script went through a series of chronological evolution. So as a student of Indian epigraphy, I've always read this person, James Princip, all of a sudden on 1837 comes to India and he deciphered the Brahmi. So now the question is, all of a sudden, who arrived in India around 1810 and he managed to decipher Brahmi. And he kind of, I won't say he was very wrong with his experiments or wrong with the discovery. He gave a chronological evolution of the charts and all everything. So his contemporary, that is Alexander Cunningham, who was the first Director General of Archaeological Survey of India. So Princip wrote to him the exact methods, what he was actually doing with the scripts and what he was doing with the inscriptions. So Cunningham kind of made it a thing, like it took him at least just 3 days to decipher the whole script. So 3 days and a long lost script, now we don't have, in between there was such a long gap, and all of a sudden in 3 days this person was able to decipher it. So now this is the story behind it. So based on the contemporary sources like Asiatic Researches and the Journal of Asiatic Society of Bengal, I came across with all these people. So interestingly, these people were also involved in the same work what Princip was actually doing. There were too many people, but I would like to speak on just 1 or 2 of them. So this is Christian Larsen, and he was a German Indologist. So this page suggests that on 1836, based on the bilingual coins, Indo-Greek coins, he was able to assign the right characters. The funny part is, in one of the volume of Journal of Asiatic Society Bengal, Princip, he himself mentions that Professor of Bonn, Christian Larsen, had sent him the letter, and by mentioning that these many characters he had already identified. But he never cared to say that he actually deciphered the exact letter, and that would help him for the further decipherment. And the next person, that is Wilkins. So Wilkins's contribution, his work starts even before this whole time. So before I go to his contribution, I would just give a quick background of him. So he belonged to the family who were actually associated with printing and presses. So of course, he was familiar with the fonts and characters, and he successfully made the first Bengali typeset fonts, and we see the first Bengali book around that time. Apart from that, another interesting part was his interest and love for Sanskrit. So he learned it from Kashinath Sharma, and he was able to publish and translate Srimad Bhagavad Gita at that time. So anyway, those are not the area I'm going to talk. So first, I mean, you can see the 3 inscriptions mentioned here, Badal Pillar and the Munger Copper. So these 2 belong to the 9th century CE, and it had Siddhamachika script. So I was talking about Brahmi, now it is Siddhamachika. So it's the chronological evolution, as I was mentioning. The Brahmi, it usually started around 3rd century BC. By 9th century CE, the characters got evolved and changed. So the last one, that is the Gya cave inscription. It belonged to the 5th and 6th century CE, and which has the letter Brahmi, which is a bit different from the Siddhamachika script. So now what is happening with this script? The time is 1770, and he managed to give a proper reading of this inscription. So when I'm saying he managed to give the proper reading of this inscription, he actually deciphered the later Brahmi. It may not be the Ashokan Brahmi, but the Gupta Brahmi he had already read. Coming back to the slide. So as I mentioned, there are already too many people, but I'm just going to emphasize on 1834. So why 1834? Because there were too many people involved in it, and they were writing on the same sort of inscription. I mean, paleographically, they belong to the same era, and they were writing on it, and they would make us small reference, or they would say some Dr. Wilkins or Mr. Wilkins had give us a reading or something like that. No one actually mentioning like he had already done his job. So, okay, till now I've been talking about Brahmi. So I'll just take a small pause. I think if not Brahmi, people are familiar with what happened with the idea of origin thing. So as we know, like apart from Charles Darwin, there were other people who were already involved in it, and at the same time they were also writing on the same fact. And this book actually talks about the other people who were simultaneously involved in the process of discovery. But none of this actually takes the achievement of Darwin. So in the same way, if I go back to Princip, so maybe the Princip did the genius work, or he single-handedly tried to do the job, but there were these people who were actually involved in this whole process. So here I would like to say, like, we can observe that like this discovery or the scientific process, these are the as a social enterprise. So, and from this diagram I wanted to show like how the network thing actually helped in the further discovery and the further result of it. So neither Watt nor Darwin or not even Princip was the beginning of the whole process. They were just a keynote or the important mark who actually linked the whole procedure, and finally we get the weightage on their names. So yeah, thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions.
So we always say that everybody is standing on the shoulders of other giants, scientists particularly. So that's what you are saying. There are many, many giants.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So like we can't see the discovery or the whole process out of the context. There is a broader context for all these. Maybe the right timing and the broader context that is required for a certain result to come out.
Thank you.
Amri has a question.
This is not a very serious question. I was just wondering, like, so we have this, you showed this phenomenon where one person gets credit for, you know, an emergent process, as you said. So I thought that at some point you would give a sort of mathematical model for this. So I was wondering if you have one.
Okay, if there is no more question, we can thank the speaker again. So third speaker of the session we have Om Prakash. He will talk about a characterization of exponential sales.
This is right. Good morning. So in this talk, I will be presenting a relatively old result from complex analysis, but it's quite interesting. So this result is about the characterization of the exponential series, and this was proved by James D. Buchholz around 1966. So it is a quite old result. Basically, so exponential function, if you look at its power series expansion around origin, so we know it can be written as a infinite sum of Zn over n factorial, and since its derivative exists everywhere, it's an entire function also, and its typical property is that it doesn't have any real or complex roots. So now what people started doing is, what if we start looking at its partial sums? So just stop at the nth degree and look at the roots of this polynomial. So one basic thing is that from fundamental theorem of algebra, we know that it has the degree many roots. So what more we can say? So since it's a partial sum of exponential function, there are some nice properties, like its derivative, the derivative of the nth partial sum is nothing but the n minus 1 degree partial sum. So using this basic property, we can derive some of the properties, like its all roots are simple, there are no multiple roots. If the degree is odd, then it has exactly one real root. If the degree is even, then it has no real roots. So what we are doing, we are by stopping at degree n, what we are doing is we are trying to approximate the exponential function with a polynomial. So exponential function in the real case also grows faster than any polynomial. So in the complex case, if the mod z increases, the exponential, the modulus of the exponential function will again increase very fast with respect to the modulus of the polynomial. So the idea is that if we are trying to approximate exponential function with a polynomial, we cannot do it over the whole complex plane. It will be in a small region around origin. So then if we see in terms of roots, exponential function doesn't have any roots in the complex plane, and polynomial, the partial sum can approximate only in a small region around origin. So there must be a zero free region around origin. So this fact was proven by the same author, in which he gave the characterization result. So if we scale the roots of the partial sum by 1 over n, so I am calling it the scaled partial sum, denoted by s and z. So its roots lies outside of the closed curve, that is mod z e to the power 1 minus z. So this curve has a name, it's a famous curve, and Gabor-Szego studied these problems way back around 1930s, I think. So he also proved that as the degree of the partial sum goes to infinity, and we look at the roots of the scaled partial sum, they will start accumulating along this curve. So we can see a little bit of demonstration here. So if I am increasing the degree of the scaled partial sum, the roots start approximating the Szego curve. So in the limit, it goes to the boundary. So people have studied the problem like what is the minimum distance of this root from the Szego curve, and those kind of problems people have studied. Okay, now about the main characterization theorem, which was proven in the paper. So given a power series, these two statements are equivalent. So if we look at the partial sum of any power series, and if it has the property
that there is a zero free region in a disk around origin, and the radius is proportional to the degree of the partial sum, then the power series represents the exponential function. So other way around is maybe easier to see, but from 1 to 2 it's a bit surprising. So this was the result that I wanted to talk about. So the main takeaway would be that if you look at the roots of the partial sum of exponential series, it has larger modulus than any other than the partial sum of any other function. So that's all.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Bhaskar might have one.
It's very nice. There is something called Lee-Yang zeros in physics in the context of statistical mechanics. You look at something called a partition function for a model.
Yes, yes.
They use Sego's theorem.
This partition function has connection to some graph polynomials also.
Yeah.
So in computer science, people are looking at the roots of these polynomials.
And they are supposed to lie on a circle and so on.
People are studying the zero free regions of those polynomials, which are called partition function in statistical physics. In computer science, people study it in terms of graph polynomials.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, if there is no question, we can thank the speaker again. Fourth speaker of the session, we have Ravi Shankar. He will talk about anomalous chiral symmetry and the QCD phase diagram.
Am I audible? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I will be talking about anomalous chiral symmetry and the QCD phase diagram. I will start with the QCD phase diagram. So on the x-axis we have baryon chemical potential. On the y-axis we have temperature. And over here this different color represents the different phases of the QCD phase diagram. This blue color represents the state where quarks and gluons are confined, whereas this yellow region which you see, these are the deconfined state. Here the degree of freedoms are quark and gluons, and this yellow region which you see over here, this is the colored superconductor. And this solid black line over here is the first order phase transition line. And this black dot is our second order critical point. And this band-like structure or the fuzzy region over here is the smooth crossover transition. And for mu b is equal to 0, the smooth over transition is roughly around 155 MeV. This was the prediction given by the lattice QCD and later verified by this experiment LHC. Many of these experiments like LHC, RIC, NIC, and FAIR, these are trying to probe the different region of this QCD phase diagram. So it will be interesting to look at the QCD phase diagram. So how it changes as a function of this quark masses. So in the chiral limit, by chiral limit I mean when the quark masses goes to 0. So here is another axis, this is the third axis. So you can see that as the quark masses goes to 0, this smooth over transition changes to a second order transition. So this red solid line represents the second order phase transition. And also this critical temperature changes to 132, which was earlier it was around 156. Okay, so we already know that in the 2+1 flavor QCD, the mass of up and down quarks are much less than the QCD scale, and due to which our U2L cross U2R symmetry is minimally broken, and the breaking of the non-singlet part happens to be around temperature 156 MeV. However, the UN part of the chiral symmetry is anomalous, and it can affect the order of the phase transition in the limit when mass of up and down quarks tends to 0. And it is not yet clear whether it is effectively restored along with the non-singlet part or not. So how we gonna study it? So one of the way to study these non-perturbative phenomena is through lattice QCD. So over here we basically discretize our theory on a discrete space and time, and we try to study it numerically. So here we study the eigenvalues spectrum of, in our work we basically study the eigenvalues spectrum of Dirac operator, which contains the valuable information about the fundamental properties of QCD. So, and we ask a question, does the non-singlet part and its singlet part get restored along the same temperature or not? And can we explain it in the terms of the eigenvalues? So here we work on a finite box with a small lattice spacing, and ultimately we take this spacing goes to 0, and also the volume of the box is thermodynamically large to relate with the physical world. So this is our setup. This is a 3-dimensional box, and these black dots are our lattice points, and these red lines which you see, these are the gauge links which connects the 2 different lattice sites. And the volume of the box is defined as n cube times a cube, where n is the number of lattice point along the spatial direction. And in the lattice unit, you can write temperature as 1 by n tau times a, where n tau is the number of lattice point along this temporal direction. And the volume of the box in our simulations are fixed to be around, in the one direction is fixed around 4 femtometer. This is the requirement to achieve the thermodynamic limit. And while generating the configurations, we fix the mass of up and down quarks to be roughly around 5 MeV, and the mass of strange quarks to be around 100 MeV. These are the physical masses. So next, when is the UA1 effectively restored? Since the flavored singlet part of the chiral symmetry is anomalous, it has any corresponding order parameter. So in order to study this problem, it was suggested by Suryak to look at the degeneracies of the integrated 2-point correlation of mesons, which are chi pi minus chi delta. So from this picture, you can see that this pi under UA1 restoration, pi and delta are the degenerate states. Similarly, sigma and eta are also the degenerate states. So when these these correlators will become degenerate, eventually you would expect that the value of chi pi minus chi delta will go to 0. And that's why what we try to calculate in the terms of the eigenvalues of the Dirac operator. So over here, we have calculated the value of chi pi minus chi delta for 3 different lattice spacing for the 4 different temperatures. All are above Tc. And finally, we have taken its continuum limit. So y-intercepts are the value of chi pi minus chi delta for the different temperatures in the continuum limit. So one thing you can observe from here, that as the temperature increases, the different color represents the different temperature. So basically, as the temperature increases, the value of chi pi minus chi delta decreases. So eventually you will expect that at some higher temperature, the value of this chi pi minus chi delta should go to 0. So that's what we try to figure it out over here. So these are the value of chi pi minus chi delta for all the 4 different temperatures in the earlier slide. And next we do a 1 by T square functional fit, which is, this is a motivation coming from this chiral perturbation theory. And we try to figure it out what is the temperature where this value of this chi pi minus chi delta goes to 0. And we estimated that the temperature is roughly around 1.14 Tc, where this after that the UA1 will get restored. So the summary of the talk. So by carefully performing a continuum extrapolation, we saw that UA1 remains effectively broken in the chiral symmetric phase of QCD below temperature 1.15 Tc. But I didn't tell you that why this is happening. So Over here, this is a plot of the histogram plot of the eigenvalues of the Dirac operator. So here you can see the two differences. Below TC, this 145 MeV is the below TC temperature. So and all are the above TCs. So above TC, you see that there is a peak like a structure over here, and the linearly rising part, which we call as bulk modes. So, but there is no any peak like a structure below TC. Earlier, in the chi pi minus chi delta calculation, I didn't mention that the maximum contribution, in fact 99% contribution is coming from this near zero mode peak part only. So this peak part is basically the reason behind the finite value of this chi pi minus chi delta. So from here also you can see that as the temperature increases, the peak height is decreasing. So when the peak will be gone, so 99% contribution will also be gone. So the value should go to zero, roughly go to zero. And this near zero peak part is also linked with these instantons, which are the topological object, and those are instantons are basically the zero energy and finite action solution for the gauge field. So next, at temperature less than Tc, the interaction between the instantons are strong, hence the near zero modes have quite significant overlap with the bulk modes. That's why we don't see any peak-like structure over here. And at temperature greater than Tc, the strength of interaction between the instantons starts to weaken. Instanton tunneling probability also decreases, resulting in the lowering of the height and the width of the near zero peak. And interplay of both these leads to a separation of this near zero and peak out of the bulk modes, which also happens to be around 1.15 Tc. This is another calculation we did in our work. I didn't mention it over here. So, and how different topological, there are many topological objects in QCD, dions, vortices. So how these different topological object plays a role in this phenomena needs to be further investigated. That's all. Thank you.
So we have time for a couple of questions. The back.
So you mentioned like extrapolating the data. So how you extrapolate the eigenvalue spectrum? I mean, what are the finite size effects, or like how?
No, we didn't extrapolate this eigenvalues plot. These are for the different temperatures coming from the simulations only.
So how you go to continuum in numerically? I mean, you mentioned.
We don't take the continuum limit of this spectrum. We calculate some observable by using these, and after that we take the continuum limit. In the continuum limit, basically you can see from here that this is for the much finer lattice. This is for the 64 cube times 16. So in continuum also, roughly you will expect that the eigenvalue spectrum should look roughly the same, like this only. Oh, that has already been taken care of. I have put some cut. That is not present over here. That already removed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does Higgs mechanism of mass generation for quarks interfere with this scenario?
No idea.
Because finally Higgs is supposed to give some mass to every particle, including quarks. So it should be interfering with the chiral symmetry break. Anyway, we can discuss it.
No, the things happens at very high speeds.
So that's what. So is there a natural separation?
Yes, yes. The electroweak scale is much higher than the QCD scale.
So if there is no more question, we can thank the speaker again. So the last speaker of the session, we have Sushant with us. We will be talking about unraveling the mystery of Fermat's last theorem.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. So in this short talk, I'll be discussing about some of the key ideas behind the proof of Fermat's last theorem. So I'll begin with the following question. So we have the following equation: x square plus y square is equal to z square. And the question said that whether there is any non-trivial integral solution to this equation. And by non-trivial, I mean that I am not allowing any of the variable to take value 0. And the answer turns out to be yes, like you can take x to be 3, 4 and 5, like x, y, z, and they will satisfy this equation. In fact, they will form a right angle triangle, and then Pythagoras theorem tells you that they will satisfy. In fact, we know all of the solution of this equation that can be classified using this type of parameterization. And one of the easy way to get this parameterization is to transform our original problem to a geometric problem. So we'll divide by z square both sides, and then we will get the following circle, unit circle, and now our problem change into finding rational points on this unit circle. So this is how we will find it. So we will fix one rational points on the circle. You can fix any. Here I have fixed 0, -1, and then you construct all the lines going via this point with rational slopes, and they will intersect the circle at some point, and in this way you will get all such solution that were in the previous slide. So now if I ask the same question with the exponent n greater than or equal to 3, then in that case the answer turns out to be no, and the reason is Fermat's last theorem that was proposed by Fermat in 1637 in one of his notebook, where he claimed to have a marvelous proof of this theorem, but he said that he don't have enough space to write it, and in margin of his notebook, So, and it took mathematical community almost 250 years to solve this problem. So it says that there is no non-trivial integral solution to the equation x power n plus y power n is equal to z power n for n greater than or equal to 3. So let me give a quick outline of the proof. So the proof go via some contrapositive argument. So suppose this equation has a non-trivial solution, call it ABC. Then what we will do, so we will associate certain geometric object called elliptic curve to this solution ABC. So I will come later what does that elliptic curve mean. So then in 1986, Kenneth A. Ribet proved that if such elliptic curve exists, then they can't be modular. So in my later part I will define what does modularity mean. So for this time you can just assume it. And then in 1994, Andrew Wells proved that a certain class of elliptic curve is modular, and that class contains elliptic curve which we were assigning to the solution of the Fermat's equation. So it contradicts Ribet's theorem, and hence such a solution cannot exist. So this is how the proof of Fermat's last theorem goes. So let me start with defining elliptic curve. So an elliptic curve is a set of rational roots of a cubic polynomial which have this form y square is equal to x cube plus ax plus b, where a and b are integer, and in addition to this we need some smoothness condition. And why these elliptic curves are important? Because of two important aspects. So the first one is they are geometric objects because they are cubic curves, and the other thing which is most important is they have an algebraic structure. So what structure they have? So this is how a typical elliptic curve look like in xy plane. So this is y square is equal to x cube minus x. So if I have to define an operation on it to make it an algebraic group, so we take 2 points, say P and Q. We will draw a straight line going via P and Q, and since it's a cubic curve, it will intersect it somewhere, and we will take its reflection and then call it its sum of P and Q. We will call it P plus Q. And what if I want to add one point to itself? So in that case I will draw a tangent at Q, and then again I will do the reflection, and that is Q plus Q. So this is how we define addition on this, and one can verify that with respect to this addition they forms an abelian group. So I will not go into detail what is the identity here because I don't have enough time. So let's go to so one of the natural question that Diophantine and arithmetic geometers study is when an elliptic curve have some rational points. So this problem is not very easy because there are elliptic curves which have finitely many rational points, some of them have infinitely many, and there are which have none at all. So one of the way to study elliptic curve is to reduce them on some nice field. So suppose this was our elliptic curve with integer coefficient. So we will reduce it to a finite field. So suppose Fp is a field of P element, and this here A and B are reduction modulo P. So now we have our elliptic curve defined over a finite field. And if you remember, there was some smoothness condition in the definition of elliptic curve. So from that, this EP will not be elliptic curve for all prime. There will be few bad primes for which this smoothness condition will not satisfy, but they are only finitely many. So that's not a problem. And the good thing about reduced elliptic curve is because they are defined over finite field, so we can count point over that. So that gives rise to certain Dirichlet L function. So for this elliptic curve E over Q, we have reduced it on some finite field. So that will give rise to some L function, which is defined using this Euler product. So if you see this AP here is related to the number of points on elliptic curve in that field. And this 0, 1 depend on whether my P is a bad prime or good prime that I had discussed in the previous slide. And you can recall that how we define a L function using Euler product. So it is the similar process. So next course of action is to define modularity. So for that I have to introduce modular form. So modular form are analytic function on complex upper half plane, which are in some sense generalization of periodic function with some additional symmetry, which is given here. So the periodicity of f implies the Fourier series expansion of f, and that gives rise to this series, Fourier series. And if we write in this Q expansion, so we have this sequence Bn here. So once we have a sequence here, we can again attach an L function to it. So that gives rise to an L function attached to a modular form, which is defined using the Fourier coefficient of the modular form. So now let's come to the connection of elliptic curves and modular form. So an elliptic curve E is said to be modular if there exists some modular form f such that the L function of elliptic curve matches with the L function of that modular form. So this is how we say that an elliptic curve is modular or not. So there was a famous conjecture due to Taniyama and Shimura, which was proposed in 1957, which says that all the elliptic curves over Q are modular. And Andrew Wiles actually proved a very special case of Taniyama-Shimura conjecture, which is that all the semi-stable elliptic curves E over Q are modular. And as a corollary of that, he got the proof of Fermat's last theorem. And a small remark here is that this Taniyama-Shimura conjecture is now a theorem due to Breuil, Conrad, Diamond, and Taylor in 2001. So they have solved it for all the cases. So if you are still with me, then you can see that we have associated a elliptic curve to the solution of Fermat's last question. So these elliptic curves are semi-stable, and Ribert's theorem tells that if this AB are coming from solution of Fermat's equation, then this EP can't be modular. But as you have seen in the previous slide, Wiles' theorem, that semi-stable elliptic curves over Q are modular, so that contradicted. Hence, such a solution cannot exist. So that's the proof of Fermat's last theorem due to Andrew Wiles. Yeah. So here is Andrew Wiles announcing his proof of Fermat's last theorem. Yeah. Thanks. That's it.
So we have time for a couple of questions.
Is there a chance that you have a simpler proof that I can understand?
Maybe. So there is a mathematical community. So like Fermat himself said that he has a marvelous proof. So no, but that Fermat's proof never appeared, right? So people might think there might be some other way to prove this that Fermat was thinking. That might be simpler, but we don't know. Yeah.
No, in connection with what Professor Bhaskaran is saying, I was recently reading a book which shows that Fermat himself realized the mistake because there is in his notes, he's basically working out this thing and he realizes a mistake. So that's why he actually never published anything. So he himself knew that the proof he had in mind was wrong and he never felt the need to erase it because it was anyway only for his private thing. Yeah. It's just chance that we happened to read it.
Any other question?
On this thing, x cube plus y cube z cube plus or minus 1, it has infinite number of solutions.
Can you repeat the equation?
X cube plus y cube is
Yeah.
x cube plus y cube is equal to z cube plus or minus 1.
Okay.
So that seems to have just adding 1.
Yeah.
seems to have enormous number of solutions, and Ramanujan himself has worked out. Is it easy to see from the elliptic curve kind of?
So the here that we have the Fermat equation, x power n plus y power n equals z power n. So in that case, it's very easy to get some nice elliptic curve for which we have this modularity condition. So like as you said, we can add plus minus 1, but in that case we might get some curve, but for that the proof of modularity theorem might be very difficult. So this type of, I don't know if this type of idea will work there. So here the curve we have, they falls in the category of phase curve. So for them we know modularity theorem and all these things. So yeah.
Any other question? Okay, if not, we can thank the speaker again.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, with this, we come to the end of this session. We can gather at 2 after lunch, so maybe I think we can disperse now.